Hello, welcome back to another video. This week I made another mixed media study using the knowledge I gained from last week, and also some new techniques. I know I said that I was going back to digital, but that video still needs some extra love before it's ready, so I decided to make another chill paint with me for this week. Thank you for your sweet and thoughtful comments so far, and I hope you enjoy my next foray into traditional media as I try to build on the lessons I learned last week. All the materials I used are listed in the description below, but the only real difference from last week is a kneaded eraser I used to lighten the sketch of the peonies and shirt prior to starting the painting process. After last week, I wanted to do more studies to get a better feel for watercolor. The reference photo, which of course is linked below, features a green color palette. I primarily used the blue and brown pigments with a splash of red in last week's watercolor layers, but I wanted to challenge myself to use the neglected greens and yellows so that I could get a better feel for how these colors mix and react to the paper. I think I still prefer the blues in the Cotman watercolor set, but I'm glad I tried working from greens as a base. Besides the color scheme, what initially drew me to the reference was the dreamy quality of the background. That hazy quality screamed, "Try wet on wet with layered washes with me," so I obliged it. Another advantage of an out-of-focus background is that it forces you to focus on overall values instead of details. Whenever I start a piece, I focus first on the big shapes and value blocks. It might be tempting to go right in with the details that catch the eye, like the patches of flowers and flecks of light shining through the trees, but if the overall value structure isn't solid, the piece will still feel flat. When I work digitally, my first few painting passes are done with a large, diffuse brush. Watercolor makes this even easier, which let me focus on colors like the differences between the warmer green of the grass and the cooler shadows of the forest. Once I had the background blocked in, I started on the figure. Working back to front is easier for pieces with multiple elements at different distances from the viewer. I was nervous about maintaining the clean value contrast between her white shirt and the darker background, but it ended up being a story about patience and my slowly but surely improving water control. Watercolor is a great traditional medium for me because it's all about patience and thoughtful choices. I tend to rush when I draw, paint, and do creative things in general. You can't do that with watercolor. You need to wait for layers to dry, to plan out your value structure, and to be deliberate when you mix colors. My impatience showed last week, and I was determined to learn from that experience. I itched to slap on the darker values of her hair and to carve out the forms in her face, but I waited instead. This resulted in better, more interesting hue shifts in her face and especially her shirt. Part of me wishes I had let that gauzy, transparent quality of the watercolor underpainting show more in the final, but at least I learned some new techniques, trying to get back to this point later on. The last step of this part of the process was dotting in the patches of wildflowers with purple watercolor and white Posca acrylic paint. I lifted some of the wet paint as I worked on the far patches to soften the value contrast between the flowers and grass. This happens naturally if you look at a landscape. Things farther away have less detail and the values are closer to each other. Emulating this in your paintings gives the illusion of space and makes backgrounds more interesting. Once everything was fully dry, I started solidifying the values with Polychromos color pencils. I wanted to keep that color temperature difference I mentioned earlier between the trees and grass, so I threw in a generous amount of blue, black, and neutral brown. I found it easier to lay down a dark base and then draw in small circles to render the impression of clumps of leaves on top with a lighter green and tan. This is easier to do with colored pencils, which let me work dark to light or light to dark to an extent. The paper stump makes its triumphant return here to lure out the pencil strokes and unify the disparate colors. I quickly realized I was going to need to put something under my hand so I didn't smudge everything I had just worked on. This is the piece of watercolor paper I used to test my color mixtures and opacity for the watercolor part of this piece, by the way. Then I moved on to the focal point, which was the face. If I was still painting, I would have worked on the meadow/field next, but I was still nervous about smudging the color pencil, so I decided to work top to bottom, at least for now. I'll admit I also really wanted to render the face because I love rendering faces. It's important to try to expand your skills and understanding, but it's also important not to lose sight of why you took up art in the first place. There's a value in the pure joy of just creating something. Anyway, moving on. You can watch last week's video to get the full reason why I love white polychromos, but for now, let's just say rendering those top planes of her face made me happy inside. The other satisfying part was adding the true blacks to the lashes and pupil. I finally had my darkest darks down, so I knew how far I could push shadows before they started competing with what should be the darkest parts of the piece. There was one hiccup in this process, however. I should have lightened her nose with a kneaded eraser before I started painting. In the photo, the edge of her nose is defined by the light highlight, contrasting against the darker skin of her cheek, but the graphite inverted this value pairing. I knew the Polychromos wasn't opaque enough to fix this, so out came the Posca. While the correction looks jarring here, I soften it later by layering on tan and white colored pencil to tone it back down to match the other highlights. It was challenging to render on this scale on rough cold pressed paper, but also rewarding because things come together so much faster. The rest of the rendering process was all about layering colors. I tried to maintain the warmth in her complexion with oranges and yellows, but cool the shadows with green and magenta. This is partially from the lighting conditions. Outdoor lights usually result in warmer lights and cooler shadows, but also from her surroundings. Light bouncing from the greenery around her will add a green tint to her color palette. A quick way to make a character feel like they're part of a scene aside from perspective is to softly paint or draw in bounce light and shadow colors that are a reflection of colors found in their surroundings. After completing the initial detail pass on the subject, I decided to go back to the wildflowers. The white polychromos comes in handy again to soften those edges and mesh the flowers in with the rest of the hazy background. I add a few details like the orange and yellow centers of the white flowers and suggestions of individual flower buds on the lupins, but I was careful not to over-render anything. The human eye can't focus on everything at once. Our brains are great at filling in details with just a little information, so that even the hint of detail lets the viewer know that these are flowers and makes this meadow feel alive and diverse. When I first started painting, I used to render everything in a scene to the same level of detail. It makes sense in your head. Something only feels complete if you can see every single little detail. The problem with that is that it actually makes it difficult to focus and appreciate a piece because the viewer doesn't know where to look. These days, I keep the contrast and detail in the focal point and let less important elements stay loose. Of course, I still make mistakes, and one of those was in the blouse. I realized too late that it was darker than I wanted it to be and that the exaggerated shadows and forms were really distracting. Luckily, I had the Posca paint pen, and I was able to lighten the values and merge the excess detail by painting over them and quickly wiping some of the acrylic off with the paper towel. Other parts I let fully dry. Leaving the paint to fully dry creates a hard edge, and wiping parts off creates a soft edge. You need both types of edges in a realistic painting to make something feel three-dimensional. Here in the shirt, I wanted mostly soft edges because it's a light, airy fabric. The creases in her pants have harder edges because of a difference in fabric composition, but they still aren't as sharp as, say, the cast shadow underneath her nose. Last week, the Posca paint pen was reserved for the final details, but this week it became an integral part of the process. I'm actually happy I made some mistakes this time around because I enjoyed this technique of layering acrylic over color pencil. I think the reason this workflow felt so natural is from my background in digital painting and graphite. In those mediums, I like to work from midtones and carve out form with shadows and highlights by erasing and adding detail. Acrylic lets me emulate that, push and pull. I think this is also part of why watercolor is still intimidating to me, because I have to work light to dark. You can lift to some extent, but you won't ever get back to true white. This is why I like mixed media. It lets me experiment with watercolor, but I know I still have reliable ways to get to the result I like if something goes awry. It takes some pressure off learning a new medium. I find that mixing old with new is a great way to get out of your comfort zone in general for any skill. It's a bit like training wheels on a bike. You don't fall and scrape your knees as often while you get the basics down, and it helps give you the confidence to eventually transition to riding without the training wheels. Of course, jumping into the deep end is also a viable method, But if you're hesitant or uncomfortable, gently easing yourself in with a familiar medium paired with a new one is a great way to start. Anyway, here are the final touches to this particular study. There's something deeply satisfying about eye shine in those final strokes. I hope you enjoyed this process video and that it inspires you to do something experimental with the supplies you already have. Thanks for watching this far, and if you want me to do more videos like this, let me know. Have a great day and see you again next week. Bye!